We're back with hour 2, so we're going to kind of continue on with our introduction to ASP.NET. So we started talking about some of the features. I want to talk a little bit about the answers you found to our 2 other questions, and I might just add a few thoughts of my own, a few other important things. So how is ASP.NET different from using another web application framework? Anybody have anything on your list when I gave you some time to research it?
Maybe be possible.
Code gets checked out on compilation times instead of errors.
Okay.
Maybe open source.
Some of it is open source. So the new version is open source, ASP.NET Core, which is the one you can run on any platform with. So Chad, that's what you installed, and it will work with Visual Studio Code. So that's open source. The original version is not. I want to talk about this for a minute. Compilation time. Well, if we have compilation time, that also must mean code is compiled. This is one of the key differences between, say, a PHP application and an ASP.NET application. ASP.NET, the code's compiled. What does that mean? And why is that important? Asa?
Turn into a machine language, so it runs faster?
Absolutely. So this leads into the fact that it's faster, and as Artem said earlier, you could use different languages, it's compiled. So when a PHP page is loaded on a user goes to any PHP page, all the pages we built last semester, here's what happens, right? We have all of these PHP tags everywhere. So what does our web server do every time it encounters one of those PHP tags? Yeah, it has to actually interpret line by line all the instructions in PHP, like open connection, run query, for next, and do all those things, right? All that code gets executed every time. With a compiled language, we write this code, but it all gets translated basically to a computer's simplest form, which is what? Yeah, binary, 1s and 0s, machine language. So we write the applications in ASP.NET with C# or in the past with Visual Basic.NET, but then we compile that code down into 1s and 0s. So when it runs much, much faster. The server doesn't have to read and interpret all of our code every time. Now, there's 2 other benefits. So one is it's faster. The second one is, as Thomas said, it gets checked at compilation time. So Tom, can you explain a bit more how that, what that actually means, or what that looks like?
So rather than when it's run as an interpreter when it's needed, it's checked before it's even run. So if you're just making something and you spell something wrong, you have a typo, it's caught before when it compiles the first time.
You got it. When we make a mistake in our PHP code, we leave out a semicolon, we type the wrong name in a command. When do we find out that we've made a mistake? Yeah, when somebody loads that web page and says, hey, your site doesn't work. I got an error, right? We find out when somebody actually tries to run the script. With code that's compiled, when we use Visual Studio, if you leave out a semicolon or you mistype the name of a command, when you try to compile or build your site into 1s and 0s, you'll get an error. And Visual Studio will say, error on line 15, missing semicolon, or error on line 23, unexpected command, if you've typed the name of a command that that doesn't recognize. So most of our errors, not all of them, but most of our errors, the editor catches before we put our websites on the internet. Right? It debugs and does stuff at compile time, which means when we publish our applications, they should have many fewer mistakes. So yes, this stuff doesn't run on Linux. It doesn't run on your Mac. The software is expensive. You get it for free, but if you were paying as a developer, you'd have to buy it, and it's expensive. It's a pain to install and configure. However, it does some of these really neat things for us. This also means something important as a developer. What does it mean to you if the code is compiled in terms of ownership of code?
That means when it's compiled, it's a closed source, so you know you can. There's no risk to your source code that's stolen because it's compiled. There's no backward transformation from compiled code to source.
Right. When we build sites with ASP.NET, we compile the code and we put the HTML pages, the CSS, the JavaScript, and our compiled locked server-side code on the server. Which means if our server gets hacked, first of all, users only get our locked code, our ones and zeros. They don't get all of the source code. If your PHP server gets hacked, what does the hacker get? Everything. What does it also mean if your client, you build in ASP.NET, and now your customer says, I'll make changes myself to the code? Right. Okay. Well, do you have Visual Studio? Have you paid me for the source code? If not, you don't get it. So this is what it looks like in a real application. All of this stuff gets compiled. So here's, we'll look at a ASP.NET application. Let's look at, say, this one. Okay. Let's look at the file types that are here. Look over on the right. So we have ASCX. So these are pieces of web pages, not full web pages, but you can probably tell from the names what the various things do. Header, footer. We have a few pages that have ASPX extensions. Actually, you can see the file types. There's some CSS, there's JavaScript, there's text files. Well, where are the C# files? They're not here. The only server-side code on the server is in this bin folder, and it's these DLL files, dynamic link libraries. These files are compiled. They're ones and zeros. If I download them, you can't open them and read them, and you can't change them. Yes, you could try to hack them, but it's not very easy. Okay. So all of the source code for this application, it lives here. Doesn't exist anywhere else except on a backup. I'm the only one who has it. So my code is fast. It's more protected from hackers. It's more protected from other developers or from customers who don't want to pay for their applications.
And it's no any way to compile from 1 to 0.
To reverse engineer it? Is it possible? Yes. Is it easy? No. And there are also some tools you can add to Visual Studio to add extra security in case people try to reverse engineer your code. The one bad thing is it does mean that in order to make changes, so if you put an ASP.NET website online and you go away for the weekend on holiday and your customer calls and said, something's broken, I need you to fix it. Well, unless you have Visual Studio with you and a copy of the source code, you can't change it. Right? You can't just install FileZilla, download the code to your machine, change it, and put it back. So it's a little bit more difficult to maintain because our code's compiled at the same time. But this is one of the main distinguishing features of ASP.NET from other web application tools. So yes, it's difficult to configure and install, and it's expensive, but at the end of the day, it has some really big benefits. Anything else we could say?
Latest version is merged into unified MVC6.
Okay, so we have MVC6. So that's now really the new ASP.NET Core, is also known as MVC6. Anything else that makes MVC different? Or sorry, that makes ASP.NET different?
Desktop applications.
Absolutely. So building .NET applications is not limited to web applications. We can build mobile apps, desktop apps, other applications. And in fact, Microsoft recently, for years, there was a tool out there. It was a plugin created by a third party called Xamarin. Has anybody ever heard of Xamarin? What does it do, ASAP?
It's just like a common coding platform that, you know, covers 90% of the iOS, Android, and Windows Phone is native, but you know, still, you can write your code in C# and they will just post that code to the iOS and Android at the same time. You're using one platform to, it's like cross-platform.
Right. So Xamarin used to be a plugin. It was its own company. You installed the plugin in Visual Studio, and it would let you use C# to build an iPhone application or an Android application. Microsoft bought Xamarin a few months ago. So now when you install Visual Studio, I think Xamarin's just still an extension you just add on. It's all integrated. So if you like Visual Studio and you like C#, you can now use it to build native mobile apps. And you don't have to write them in Swift for iOS. You don't have to write them in Java for Android. You can write them in C# and compile an iOS version, compile a different version for Android. So this is fairly new. What about the job market? Anybody find out anything about jobs for C# developers?
They get paid good.
Why do you suppose a C# developer with, say, 2 years of experience is more likely to have a higher salary than a PHP developer of the same experience? Absolutely. The pool of people who learn this technology is much smaller. Okay. And there's no cost for someone to learn PHP. Well, you just need Notepad and a free WAMP or XAMPP server. Right? You guys get access to Visual Studio free because you're Georgian students. Right? But most people aren't going to go learn ASP.NET on their own if they've never programmed before. It's not really a beginner's tool. It's a tool for people who've learned a little bit and have some training in programming. Okay. If we had a look, so here I just ran the search this morning. So I searched C# in Ontario. That was the number of jobs right now in the last 30 days on this site. Do you expect, will PHP be more or less, do you think? Half. Let's try here. It's 116. Let's see what they say. So closer, but less. So, it's kind of a question of the right tool for the job. PHP is great for small applications. ASP.NET is largely designed for enterprise level applications, big organizations, large companies, government, not-for-profits, hospitals, school boards, things like that, government. That's a good place where you're going to see a lot of ASP.NET development. One of my friends is a project manager with Northern and Indian Affairs for the federal government. All of their development is ASP.NET. They don't use anything else. They do GIS tools and mapping tools, all they've ever used. He's been there for years and years and years, and they don't use anything else. So if you're in a large corporate environment, there's a really good chance that you're going to see these technologies. We use them here at Georgian, right? It runs our mail. It runs our school intranet. It's all ASP.NET tools. So the job market's pretty good. Okay. And as Chad said, there's fewer, so less competition. There's many more people that know PHP. That's why there's so many C# jobs available, because there just aren't C# developers. And in fact, there's one company here in town that does exclusively ASP.NET development. They're over on Bell Farm Road, and a number of grads from the program are now working there. The company's Pavlix.com. Some of you may have heard of them. So if you like ASP.NET, it's a good place to go knocking on their door. Okay. Now, one warning, because this happens every time I teach this class, and I've taught it many times. There's always a few people in the class who say, I hate Microsoft everything. I hate Microsoft. I hate how they operate as a company. I'm not interested in their tools or technologies. I'm never going to use them. And that's fine. Okay. If you choose when you step out of here that you're never going to use ASP.NET, you have no interest in working with this technology at all, that's fine. It's still a learning experience for you. You're still going to learn from it. And there is a chance that that technology choice won't be given to you, even if you work for yourself and say, I'm going to pick my own tools, right? Chad, someone may say to you, I have a big project for you. I have an existing ASP.NET infrastructure and there's stuff I want to do with it. So it's going to help you in your future courses, but there's a lot of this technology out there. And chances are, if you're a web developer, sooner or later, you're going to wind up working with this technology, whether you want to or not. The only other thing I would say is, if you're bound and determined to hate the technology, again, that's fine, but give it a chance. Because I also typically have of those students who say, I really hate Microsoft, usually at least one or two of them halfway through the course say, you know what this stuff can do is actually kind of neat. It makes my life as a developer so much easier than this, than PHP. It automates so many things for me so I can focus on the logic of my application.
It's very good technology, but why it's not so popular? Why we don't see so many websites?
Great, that's a great question. Anybody want to take a guess at that answer? So Artem is asking, if the technology is so good, or can be so good, why is it maybe not the most popular software out there? Margot?
Well, I guess it's cost, which is sort of my question. What does it cost? Is that the answer?
Okay, so cost is a big one, right? There is, now anybody can go and get a community edition of Visual Studio. They've only started doing that in the last few years. And first of all, the community edition is non-commercial use. So it's so you can learn, but technically you're not supposed to buy the community version and go and get paid with it, right? So the original version of Visual Studio came out in 2002. I bought it. Anybody want to guess what I paid for that? What'd you say, Brad?
10,000.
The original developer version of
Like forever, or which period of time?
No, so that was 2002. Then they came out with a new version in 2003, which I didn't buy. Then they came out with 2005, which was a major change because that was .NET 1 to .NET 2. So if you already had a license, you could upgrade for $500. So in 2005, 3 years later, I paid another $500 American to upgrade to Visual Studio 2005. And then I used 2005. They came out with a version in 2008. I didn't upgrade. 2010, I didn't upgrade. And now they've come out with versions in 12, 13, 15. So that's the number one reason is if you want it, you can't do this without Visual Studio. So for starters, it was $2,000 just to get started, right? What does it cost you for PHP? Nothing. So that's actually a great question. Let's look. If you weren't a Georgian student and you were going to go be a developer and say, I want, say, professional, which is the version I bought, is it even going to show us? You know, we probably have to look on Amazon. Let's see. Is this a book? Okay, here's the enterprise version. Not available. Let's see what it costs. So they don't even have the 2015. So this version is now 3 years old. The professional version of 2013 is selling for $350 US. So it's come down in price, but I don't know exactly. It's not as expensive as it used to be. The new Enterprise Edition is $6,000 new. Those are US prices.
Professional limited is on the Visual Studio website.
Yep. So professional is a lot cheaper. So you could get the professional. So that's probably $499 US. So it's cheap.
That's for like a small business.
Yeah, professional would probably be sufficient for your typical developer. So cost is one. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I wanted to actually give you a detailed answer. So it was expensive, number one. Number two, you had to be a Windows user.
And also, it works great in the Microsoft environment, but you try to implement something else, it's kind of okay.
Right. Right. So if you have other infrastructure, it's not a good fit. You basically have to be running a Microsoft environment. Yes. And the other thing is, as I said earlier, you have to have a bit of a programming background to understand how to use it. It's a little bit dangerous in the tool of someone with no training whatsoever. PHP is easy enough to learn. You're going to say something else, I said?
And also, we don't talk about the server side. We need the IIS server, which they kind of much more expensive than Linux servers. So
Right. That's the other thing. If you were going to run it on your own server, you need a Windows IIS. That's the name of Microsoft's web server. And it's much more expensive than running an Apache server on Linux. So again, comes back to cost in many ways. But at the end of the day, once we have the skills, that's good for us because now we have those skills in the marketplace and there aren't a lot of developers without those skills. Okay. Somebody sent me this the other day. This, in many ways, sums up one of the reasons Visual Studio is so good. Right? The best software we write is software that we didn't write. So one of the things that Microsoft did when they created ASP.NET way back in 2002 is they said, what are the things developers have to do over and over again from one site to another to another? Can't we just automate these things? Can't we create a pre-built login page, for example? Can't we create a whole security system that you could just add to your applications rather than coding these things yourself every time? Can't we create, one of the other things is they want you to create a template. So can't I create, look, all my pages on the site are going to look the same. So can't I put my CSS links and JavaScript here with this header and this footer and this layout and put it in a layout file and let all the pages use that layout file rather than us having to include them all manually. So they've automated all these things for us, which is great. So a couple visuals for the visual learners in the class. This is a little bit old, but this is kind of how all the pieces fit together. We can choose our language. Doesn't matter what language we use, we're going to write in Visual Studio. We might write web applications, we might write desktop applications. We then have this kind of data layer. So Microsoft has this framework called the Entity Framework that we'll use that does all of the data for us. We won't need to write any SQL in this class. Entity Framework will handle all of our create, read, update, and delete commands. And then it all gets compiled down to machine language, basically, this common runtime of ones and zeros.
It's all these DLL files.
Yep, it all gets compiled. All of the server-side code. The front end is still all the HTML. That stuff we still code in HTML. One of the couple other nice features as developers, and There's two other nice features for developers besides that our code is compiled. Every time we build a page in web forms, let's say we're going to build a page called student.aspx. If this was a PHP page, we might have student.php. What kind of code goes in that PHP file? If you opened up the source code and looked at it, we'd see a few different things. What would we see in there? Yeah, we'd see all of our front-end HTML, all of our markup, and we have all of these PHP tags in between, right? And we call that, Microsoft developers call that spaghetti code. You take all the HTML, you take all the pieces of PHP, and you mash them together, right? So we have 2 lines of HTML, 3 lines of PHP, 2 more lines of HTML. That's what our code looks like. When Microsoft came out with ASP.NET, they said, this is a terrible model. We're going to break that. So if we want a page called student, we add a student page in Visual Studio. It actually creates 2 files, actually 3 files that are linked together. We have this file where that's just the HTML. And then we also get this. We get the same page with a .cs extension. What do you suppose goes in that file? Yeah, all the logic, all the C# code. So it's actually 2 separate files. They have the same name, but this one has an extra extension. So how does this help us as a developer? Why is this beneficial? Well, it's much easier to read, yes. Right. Right? All of our markup is separated from all of our logic and code. We can even work, so if Matt and Priyank are working together, Matt can say, Priyank, don't touch the SPX files. I'm writing all the C# code, but I won't touch any of your HTML markup.
I understand that it's easier to read when if you don't have a lot of lines. But for example, if you have big project and it's with PHP and HTML, it's easy to see, for example, if PHP embedded some tag, yeah, and case it's broken, like you see, yeah, it's a problem where you can modify it here. Yeah. But in case of C#, you have to go to C# file and look for where this module or this loop or where this stuff is.
You know what? That brings me to one other feature. You're right, and there's a tool in Visual Studio to help us. What Visual Studio also offers is real-time debugging. So we can run our application on a local server, and we can put a stop point in our code that says run the page in the browser, and when it comes to this line, jump into the code, and we can go through it 1 line at a time. So we can actually watch our server-side code execute 1 line at a time. With PHP, we have no way to do this, right? If we want to see what our PHP code is doing, we write a whole bunch of echo commands, and we load the page in the browser, and we see what the page is printing out. With Visual Studio, you can actually see the code execute at any point, 1 line at a time, even if it goes from one file to another and back. So this file calls a function over here. We can watch it, see what happens over here, and see what comes back. So my database query isn't getting anything. We can check. Did I start the query? Yep. What does the query hold? Oh, it's empty. Okay, well, the problem's over here.
PHP can't do that with XML.
Okay, so that's, I haven't used it, but thank you. That's I think hasn't been around as long. This has been around since, they've done this really since the first version, since 2002. There are some tools we can do it. It's baked right into Visual Studio, and it's really easy to use. To show you an example of what our C# code might look like, the syntax will look similar to PHP, right? It's a C-based language. So here's what some code might look like. You know, we have semicolons at the end. Our C# code is going to be case sensitive, just like your PHP code is. All of the objects you create are case sensitive. Okay. We'll use double equals for comparison. So, and curly braces around our sets of instructions. So syntax-wise is really nothing very new here. The exact same code written in Visual Basic would look something like this. So there are no semicolons or curly braces, and it's not case sensitive. I actually find this is easier, but this is dying. If you ever, and it's so clear, it's much more kind of English-like. If you ever got asked to work in an application in Visual Basic, it would be no problem. It would be pretty easy. The code is actually, I find, clearer and easier to read. So this is a, what's this? A function to save a new registration. And there's the two versions of it. One other thing. In terms of how that common language runtime works, again, for visual learners, it looks something like this. So no matter what language we use, it's compiled down to that same code. And that's what lives on the server, is that binary code, those DLLs. So if we change the server-side code, all we have to do in Visual Studio is change our C# file, compile our application, make sure we don't get an error, and then you just have to copy the new DLL to the upload the DLL to the server from your local bin folder to the bin folder on the server. So the DLL that we see here, most of these are supporting libraries. This is my actual C# code. So this just contains the contents of all the .cs files rolled together. But the individual CS files that actually have the code, I just keep those on my computer. I don't have to put those on the server. So that's kind of how this all will fit together. So more and more at the beginning, when ASP.NET came out, C# was new. Microsoft created it when they created ASP.NET. Previously, everything was written like this in Visual Basic. As I said, Visual Basic is basically gone. You probably won't even find many code samples unless they're really old in Visual Basic. For years, Microsoft would do all their examples in both languages. So you wanted to know how a feature worked, you would click, here's the C# link, here's the Visual Basic link. Now everything is C# and will continue to be C#.
You have that one look like in C#.
Yep. Yeah, that was the first example.
Okay, yeah.
So it's the same.
Just has the width one.
You see the semicolons and the curly braces, and this version's case sensitive, and the Visual Basic version isn't. So this is actual code from a real application that I wrote years ago in Visual Basic, and there's some free tools online that let you convert your code. So I just copied this function into one of those converters and clicked the Convert to C# button, and it spit out, gave me that version back. So you could actually go back and forth. But pretty much you won't see anything. Any kind of modern tutorials, or examples, they'll all be C#.
Well, that doesn't seem very good because you change the variables for the initial width ones.
Yeah.
Just change it whatever you want.
You got it. Yeah. The one other thing is, I mean, it's a good and a bad thing that this technology is controlled by one company. It's bad that it's expensive, it's proprietary. Up until recently, it wasn't open source. The good news is, because you have one company standing behind it, in terms of a resource center, the main primary ASP.NET site has tons here for developers. Okay? So you don't need to look online for any other resource. If you want help, you want tools, you want tips, you want tutorials, everything is here. So if you go into Learn, for example, here are the two versions. There's the ASP.NET, which is what we'll do for the first about 7-8 weeks of the class. And then we'll try to maybe look at ASP.NET Core. We can do the MVC version with either one of those. And there's tons of tutorials and resources here. So there's videos, there's sample applications you can walk through.
So Visual Studio Code, is it just a compiler on the server?
Visual Studio Code,
It's just an IDE.
it's an IDE. Many of you worked with it in JavaScript because Tom, I remember Tom was using Visual Studio Code. You can only do the new version. You can only do ASP.NET MVC, which with the core version with Visual Studio Code. It doesn't support the old version, which are web forms. And web forms actually has a visual interface. So if you have to build a form, you can actually drag and drop all the form controls. You don't have to type them all out. It has a WYSIWYG editor as well as a code editor. That won't work in Visual Studio Code. That's why you need the original Visual Studio. So there's lots here. There's also terrific forums. I have found answers to many, many problems I couldn't solve by posting a question on the ASP.NET forum. All you need is a Microsoft account. You can post any question. There are many, many experienced developers who spend a lot of their day watching for questions on here and answering your questions. Okay, so this is a great resource to go to if you need help, tips, anything. Of course, you can come to me, but you can always post a question here. Hey, I can't get this to work. What does this error mean? What is a good tool to use for this? Okay, go to the ASP.NET forum and post it there. You'll get lots of good answers. And many times if you search on Google for an ASP.NET problem and you click the link, here's where it will take you. It will take you to the thread on the ASP.NET forums where somebody asked the exact same question or had the same problem that you had. This is where you'll find answers. Okay, so it's very well resourced. Okay, let's take a break here. We'll take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10 o'clock. And what I want to do for the last hour of class is actually play around in Visual Studio a bit. We won't do anything complicated. We'll kind of take it for a test drive, see what's in there and what some of the things it can do are.
Does it make sense to change if I have this free Visual Studio Code version? That makes sense to download